Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 215, William Holden Watt. Part 2. Part 2 covers the youngest in the family and the youngest of William Holden Watt's siblings, Walter Oswald Watt. He achieved quite a bit for Australia, and he even has a book written about him. He was born on the 11th of February 1878 at Bournemouth in Hampshire, England. He was only 1 when his mother died. At the age of 11, Toby, as he was named by his family, was sent to be educated in England at Clifton College in Bristol and Trinity College in Cambridge. He returned to Sydney in 1900 and became a second lieutenant in the New South Wales Scottish Rifles. As with his brothers, he had interests in the properties that his father owned, Llanillo, Gornal and Gunnegrow in New South Wales, as well as the Queensland cattle stations Strathmore at Bowen and Glen Prairie at Rockhampton. In 1902, he was appointed aide-de-camp to the Governor of New South Wales, Admiral Sir Harry Rawson. On September 27, 1902, he married Muriel Maud Williams, who was the daughter of a Toorak lawyer and later Judge Sir Hartley Williams. And in the Melbourne Age on the 29th of September 1902, it outlines the wedding in the paper. Considerable interest attached to the wedding on Saturday of Miss Muriel Williams, second daughter of Sir Hartley Williams, to Captain Walter Oswald Watt, ADC, to His Excellency Sir Harry Rawson, Governor of New South Wales. The ceremony was performed at St John's Church in Toorak Road. There was a large marquee erected on the lawn. No speeches were made, and later in the afternoon Captain and Mrs Watt left for Flinders, where their honeymoon will be spent. On their return, Captain and Mrs Watt will reside in England for a year and a half, at the end of which time Captain Watt will resume his position on Sir Harry Rawson's staff in Sydney. So in 1904 they headed back to England and he obtained his Master of Arts degree from Cambridge, and in the October of 1905 he was promoted captain to the Scottish Rifles. On a subsequent trip to England he took flying lessons at the Bristol Aviation School on Salisbury Plain, and he attained his Royal Aero Club certificate on the 1st of August 1911, becoming the first Australian citizen to be suitably qualified. On the 3rd of August 1911 in the Melbourne Argus, Captain Walter Oswald Watt of the New South Wales Scottish Rifles has been awarded a pilot certificate for proficiency in aviation. Oswald continued his passion for planes and set up as a civilian flyer in Australia when he returned in November 1911, publicly declaring that the time was rapidly approaching when an Aero Corps would have to be inaugurated as part of the country's military defence scheme. He also recommended manufacturing foreign-designed aircraft under licence in Australia, which did occur in Australia after the Second World War. In April 1912, he purchased a property at Bilgola, named Bilgola Cottage. He lived simply, enjoying the beach, fishing, swimming and entertaining guests, who remarked at the contrast of the bare essentials kept in this cottage compared to the opulent society lifestyle that he lived in elsewhere. On the 27th of June 1913 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, it announced the divorce between Muriel Maud Watt, formerly Williams, and Captain Walter Oswald Watt. Muriel divorced him on the grounds of misconduct with some woman or women unknown to the petitioner in Sydney. They had one child of the marriage, a boy, James, and Muriel stated that there were acts of misconduct with a woman known as Ivy Shilling in Sydney between the 18th of December 1911 and July the 3rd, 1912, which was specifically alleged in the petition. The petitioner in evidence said that her husband had at various times been aide-de-camp to Sir Frederick Darley and Sir Harry Rawson. He was an officer of the New South Wales Scottish Rifles and possessed considerable property, including a station at Carrathul, where she believed he was now. And that was Howlong Station that was originally owned by his brother. After their marriage, they made several trips to England. Soon after their arrival in England, in October 1909, on one particular trip, the respondent left for Australia, ostensibly on business. On his return to London, there was an extraordinary difference in his manner towards her. When asked for an explanation, he said that he was ill. Later, he confessed that he was quite satisfied with her mode of living and could find no fault with her. He denied that there was any other woman in Australia of whom he had grown fond and objected to being questioned on the subject. The pair paid a short visit to Cairo, but matters were so bad between them that she returned home. In August 1911, they decided to visit Russia, but the trip was a failure. On reaching London again, the respondent suggested a separation or a divorce, but the petitioner said she had no desire for either, suggesting that they should live apart for a time and ascertain if the condition could improve. It was then arranged that she would visit India, and the respondent said he would go to Australia. The witness came to Australia from India in April 1912, and when crossing the Bight, she received a wireless message from her husband informing her that he was on a steamer travelling in the opposite direction. In August 1912, while in Melbourne, she received a letter from the respondent, and in the September returned to London and consulted her solicitor, who advised a certain course which she adopted. She has not seen her husband since September 1911. May Steele, a housemaid employed at Cromer Flats in Phillip Street, where Captain Watts resided in 1911, said that she very often had seen Miss Ivy Schilling at the respondent's flat. She came nearly every day at various times, often at meal times, sometimes by herself and sometimes in Captain Watts's company. Sometimes other people were present. The witness had seen Miss Schilling go into the bedroom to remove her hat. Mr. Whitfield asked what did she call Captain Watt. She said Oswald. What did he call her? And she said Bob. Continuing, the witness said that she occasionally saw the respondent drive away in a motorcar with Miss Schilling on Saturday afternoons, and on such occasions he would not return until the Monday. Evidence as to the visits to the flat were also given by Edward Joseph Best, the lift attendant, and Isabel Best, his wife, who said that she saw Miss Schilling in the respondent's flat one afternoon when she was walking about with her hat off. In your duties about the flat, have you ever found anything to indicate the presence of a woman there? She said, I found hairpins and on one occasion 2 pearls in Captain Watts's bed. After the close of the petitioner's case, His Honour remarked that the issue of adultery had not been proved, and if the lady mentioned in the suit had appeared, he would have discharged her from the suit, as there was not a scintilla of evidence against her. His Honour, however, looked upon the husband's general admissions with the greatest suspicion, and it appeared that the letter in which they were contained had been written with the express purpose of getting rid of the marriage, and not at all in a creditable way. There must, however, be some substantial corroboration of the admissions, and he was in considerable doubt in the matter and would accordingly reserve judgment. And nearly 2 weeks later, on the 30th of June 1913, in the Charters Towers Evening Telegraph, the investigation has not yet been concluded in the divorce suit of Muriel Maud Watt versus Captain Walter Oswald Watt, and the matter was to stand over on the application of the petitioner's counsel, who sought an adjournment that he might secure further witnesses. His Honour felt very strongly with regard to the danger of relaxing rules laid down in such cases. The court did not dissolve a marriage because one party desired to get rid of it. If the court did that, it would be putting in the hands of either party to a marriage to dissolve it at his or own option. There was no question of collusion between the parties. The petitioner was perfectly justified in bringing the petition to the court. The question was not whether she was satisfied with the admission of her husband, but whether the court on the whole saw that the facts were satisfactory, that all doubt of the genuineness of the confession was removed. And on the 16th of September 1913, in the Launceston Daily Telegraph, it was reported from Sydney that an additional witness, John Gregory, who'd been a night porter at the Oxford Hotel during the time Miss Ivy Schilling was a guest at the house, stated that Captain Watt frequently visited Miss Schilling and drove her out in his motor car. They would sometimes return at 3 a.m. or as late as 4 a.m. On such occasions, Miss Schilling would go upstairs alone. He was asked, did you at any time notice any impropriety with the respondent called? He said no, Mr. Watt would go upstairs and bring Miss Schilling himself. He knew the run of the hotel and we did not bother. His Honour remarked that it was an extraordinary feature of the case that while so much evidence has been given as to the respondent and Miss Schilling being together, none of the witnesses had noticed any impropriety, and the judgment was again reserved. So it wasn't until the 23rd of April 1914, when it was announced in the Sydney Evening News, that the last of the divorce case between Muriel Maud Watt and Walter Oswald Watt, which excited a considerable interest at its hearing in the Sydney Divorce Court in September, was heard this morning when Mr. Windire, on behalf of the petitioner, applied to Justice Gordon to have the decree nisi made absolute. The petitioner also asked for the custody of the child. Counsel for the respondent appeared to consent to the court's order, and the decree was made absolute and granted the application for the custody of the child. Walter then left Australia and went to Egypt. He spent several months there where he purchased and practiced flying a monoplane. And while there, he met leading French aviators, including Louis Blériot and Roland Garros. Thinking that Britain would not be involved in any European war, he offered his services and his plane to the French, and he became an ordinary soldier in the aviation militaire section of the French Foreign Legion. He was awarded the Légion d'Honneur and the Croix de Guerre, and was given the brevet rank of captain. While serving France, he painted a kangaroo on the nose of his plane, and he named it Advance Australia. Considered a no-nonsense type, he once introduced himself to a British pilot with the words, "I'm an Australian and I haven't got any manners." And this was announced in the paper on the 22nd of December 1915 in the Evening Telegraph at Charters Towers, Queensland. Tribute to Australian Airmen. Captain Walter Oswald Watt, an aviation officer in the Australian Forces, is mentioned in the Army orders with the following note: a fine officer, a pilot of great daring and imperturbable coolness, never hesitates to fly above the enemy's lines at a low altitude whenever the circumstances require it, has made numerous most dangerous reconnaissances, and his machine has frequently been struck by shell splinters. Although wounded in the head on the 8th of August, he continues his reconnaissance in great coolness. In 1916, Oswald transferred to the newly formed Australian Flying Corps with the rank of captain, and he was in command of B Flight No. 1 Squadron that was stationed at Egypt. In this September, he was promoted to major and took command of the No. 2 Squadron that was being formed in Egypt. The new squadron was sent to England at Tetbury for training in early 1917 and arrived at the Western Front in this September. He kept 3 Australian squadrons in France throughout the First World War. Charles Bean visited the No. 2 Squadron after the Battle of Cambrai, where Watt became famous for leading his squadrons on daring low-level strafing attacks and recorded his impressions of its work. They are winning themselves a magnificent name, this first Australian fighting squadron. It is Watt who has worked them up to this remarkably high level of conduct and general tone. As the squadron commander, Watt worked long hours. He rose at 5 a.m. and gave moral support to his dawn patrols, and according to Bean, the heavy fighting at Cambrai had left Watt very wan. He fell asleep after dinner. In February 1918, Watt was then a lieutenant colonel and was promoted to command the 4 squadrons, numbers 5, 6, 7 and 8, of the Australian Training Wing at Tetbury, and he excelled as a leader who inspired his crews with his ideals of service. The novelist W.J. Locke visited him after the armistice and noted, "There was not one who did not confide to me his pride in serving under a leader so distinguished." A pilot later opined that as well as having courage, determination and an immense capacity for work, Watt possessed the greatest factor in leadership, a genius for endearing himself without conscious effort to all who served under him. At the end of the war, he was presented by those who served under him with a magnificent miniature aeroplane in silver, a trophy of which he was proud. In January 1919, he was appointed an OBE, and he brought his wing back to Australia in the Empress of India, a P&O liner requisitioned as a troop ship, which Lawrence of Arabia also sailed home in. And Oswald and his fellow airmen arrived home in June 1919. On the 11th of January 1919 in the Adelaide Observer, it says Major Walter Oswald Watt, who's been made an officer of the British Empire Order, was one of the first quartet of instructors of the Australian Flying Corps. He's the son of the late Mr. J.B. Watt, MLC of New South Wales, and was born in Sydney in 1878. He was promoted captain in the old Australian military forces in 1905 and transferred to the Reserve of Officers. In 1913, he went to England to study aviation, returned to Australia, and when the war broke out, went to France and joined the French Flying Corps. Early in 1915, he was awarded the French decoration of the Legion of Honour. On his return to Australia, he was elected president of the New South Wales section of the Australian Aero Club, and after the war, he lobbied politicians for improved safety measures in civil aviation, and he was well known for his generosity to former AFC comrades and his efforts to find them employment. In 1920, he was offered a position of controller of civil aviation, but declined because of business commitments. He was partner in the family firm Gilchrist, Watt and Sanderson, and he was also director of the Australian Alum Company, the Great Britain Tin Mining Company, the Sogery Para Rubber Company, and Art in Australia Limited. Oswald died on the 21st of May 1921 in Newport, New South Wales, and the Maitland Daily Mercury outlined his death. Colonel Watt drowned. Tragic end to a brilliant career. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Oswald Watt, OBE, DSO, and Croix de Guerre met with a tragic end on Saturday, being drowned while bathing at Newport. Colonel Watt, who was a member of the firm Gilchrist, Watt and Sanderson, had been staying at his weekend residence at Bilgola Beach, and he went down to the water accompanied by his caretaker Sidney Jones. There was a strong undercurrent running when Colonel Watt went in, and he was soon noticed to be in difficulties. Jones plunged into the breakers and made an effort to reach him, but without success. He then ran to the Newport Hotel for help. A big party rushed to the scene, but the unfortunate man was nowhere to be seen. It was not until some hours later that 2 men in a rowing boat recovered the body. Colonel Watt had a distinguished war record and was regarded as the father of aviation in Australia. He performed brilliant work in France, and he was one of the most popular pilots in the French army, and for the first 18 months of the war, he flew regularly every second day and met with great success. An indication of the courage with which he tackled his task was given by the fact that on one occasion, after scouring information of the utmost importance to the French army, his aeroplane was hit no fewer than 16 times. The deed for which the late Colonel Watt gained the Legion of Honour was a particularly striking one. He'd been forced to land midway between the French and German lines. He and his observer immediately came under heavy fire from the enemy's trenches, and after disentangling themselves from their machine, had to run a distance of 300 yards, still under the enemy's fire. They succeeded in reaching the French lines safely, and the information which they brought back proved to be of the greatest possible value. Some little time afterwards, the late Colonel Watt was awarded the Croix de Guerre, to which were subsequently added 3 of the highly coveted palm leaves. These were personally presented to Colonel Watt by General Joffre. The French government realised that an officer of Colonel Watt's calibre was being wasted in the inferior rank which he was compelled to hold. They therefore suggested that he should join the Australian Flying Service, which had just been formed. Colonel Watt followed this advice and went to Egypt with the rank of Major. After being second in command for some time, he took the No. 2 Squadron to England. On September the 21st, 1917, he flew his squadron of 24 machines across the Channel to France and arrived without a mishap. The record of Colonel Watt's squadron during the following 9 months in France has seldom, if ever, been excelled. They were a happy family. Many of the pilots were killed, but the squadron gained a large number of DSOs, military crosses and other decorations. Colonel Watt was the owner of Howlong Station and a liberal supporter of Hay local enterprises. He was one of the contributors of £250 to the Hay War Memorial High School, a scheme which, in the covering letter forwarding his cheque, he described as one of the best forms of war memorial which he'd heard of. The deceased gentleman was beyond the recognised age of flying. He was over 40 when the war broke out, but it is said of him that he never asked a pilot to do anything he would not do himself. Great regret was expressed in Carrothall and Hay when the news of his death came to hand. And on the 9th of July 1921 in the Sydney Morning Herald, in the course of an appreciation of the late Colonel Walter Oswald Watt, the aeroplane, copies of which have just reached Sydney, says, "The British Empire in general and the Commonwealth of Australia in particular have begun a movement in Australia which those who knew and loved him will carry on for his sake and as a monument to his memory. Australia has sent us many fine men who have done great work for aviation and for the Empire, but none quite so splendid as Oswald Watt." And on the 11th of October 1921, Oswald's probate came through. The estate of the late Colonel Walter Oswald Watt, grazier of Howlong Station, who was drowned near Newport in May last, was valued for probate at £186,845. The testator made a large number of bequests, principally to relatives, and directed that the residue of his property should be placed upon trust for Sydney University with absolute discretion on its use. £136,818 was represented in interests in partnership and £19,249 in shares in public companies. He bequeathed legacies of £1,000 to the following persons on attaining the age of 21 years. His nieces, Pauline and Felicity Watt, daughters of his brother Ernest Alexander, son of Mr. Walter Allen of Datchet in England, Oswald Uthoff, son of his niece, Mrs. Robert Uthoff, Eleanor Caldwell, daughter of his sister, Mrs. Gordon Caldwell, Annie Jamieson of Macquarie Street, Sydney, Helen Phillips, daughter of Roy Cecil Phillips of Colliamberley. He left legacies of £15,000 each to his sisters, Margaret Gilchrist Caldwell, Florence Gordon Caldwell and Eleanor Mary Bethune, and £20,000 to his brother, Ernest Alexander Stewart Watt, £500 to the commandment of the Royal Military College at Duntroon to invest and apply the income in the purchase every year of a pair of field glasses to be handed to the cadet writing the best essay dealing with any aspect of military aviation or aeronautics, and £15,000 to be invested for 5 years from the date of his death, the income accruing therefrom to be paid to Mrs. Rebecca Hamilton Ryrie, née Osborne of Sydney, during her life. The testator stated that in the event of his son, James Oswald Watt, or his issue failing to succeed in the share or portion given or intended for him or his children under the marriage settlement dated the 26th of September 1902, on the marriage of his mother and testator, and under another settlement of £45,000 made by him in November 1913, he directed that the funds, which on such failure would revert or fall into his estate and should be realised, and £20,000 of it divided between his brother, Ernest Watt, and his sisters, Margaret Caldwell and Eleanor Bethune, in equal shares. £10,000 to his trustees to divide amongst charitable institutions in New South Wales and Queensland, as they selected, provided that such charities did not impose any qualifications or conditions as to religion on recipients, £1,000 each to the Royal Prince Alfred and Sydney hospitals. By a codicil, the testator bequeathed £250 to the headmaster of Carrithwell Public School to be applied for the benefit of its pupils, £500 to the Australian Aero Club for purchase of a gold medal to be presented every year to the aviator who, in the opinion of the Council, does the most brilliant performance in the air in the Commonwealth, or to an Australian-born aviator performing the most brilliant feat outside the Commonwealth. He left a legacy of £1,000 and all debentures belonging to him to the Committee of the Union Club for the benefit of the club. He also bequeathed about 50 legacies ranging from £1,000 to £250 to relatives and others, including £1,000 each to Mrs. James Burns, care of Burns, Phillip and Company, Mrs. Sydney Jameson of Potts Point, Sydney, Miss Muriel Mills, daughter of Mr. David Mills of Sydney, £250 each to Mrs. Burnside, testator's old nurse, and Nurse Masher of Terraces Private Hospital, and £500 each to Mr. E.S. Dunhill, solicitor of Sydney, Miss Nell Knox of Lura, Miss Joan Tregarthen of Wallara, Miss Sissy Jameson of Bank Chambers, Sydney, Miss Ruth MacArthur of Double Bay and Miss Phyllis MacArthur of Double Bay, Imperial Service Club, New South Wales section of the Australian Aero Club. The residue of his estate is to be devised and bequeathed to his trustees in trust for the Sydney University. Testator directed that his body should be cremated, and whether it was cremated or buried, that no memorial of any kind should indicate where his ashes or his body lay. He also expressly desired that no sort of mourning should be worn for him by any of his relatives. Oswald was considered one of Sydney University's greatest benefactors, and as a result he was commemorated by the Oswald Watt Fund. In May 1923, the Oswald Watt wing of the Havilah Home for Orphans at Wahroonga was opened by the Governor-General of Australia. And there's an article that says, on Anzac Day, in the presence of a large gathering, including the joint committees of the Church of England Homes and Hostels for Children, Mrs. Ernest Watt, sister-in-law of the late Colonel Oswald Watt, the famous airman, laid the foundation of a building to be called the Oswald Watt Wing, in extension of the Havilah Home. Prior to the ceremony, a short dedicated service was conducted by Archdeacon Darcy Irvine and Reverend Stephen Taylor, rector of the local parish. The addition will provide 3 additional dormitories, 2-day nurseries, accommodation for extra nurses and a stall dining room. 16 years after his death, on the 23rd of October 1937 in Sydney. In the Equity Court today, questions of law involve the administration of £48,000 arising from a marriage settlement by the late Walter Oswald Watt were argued. Plaintiff was the Perpetual Trustee Company Limited, and the defendants were James Oswald Watt of Mount Eliza, Victoria, Ernest Alexander Stewart Watt of Bligh Street, Sydney, and the University of Sydney. The marriage settlement was made on the 26th of September 1902 in an indenture between Walter Oswald Watt and Muriel Maud Watt, formerly Williams. Mrs. Watt obtained a decree nisi against her husband in September 1913. In October 1913, another indenture entered between the same parties provided that, in consideration of Mrs. Watt not applying for alimony, her former husband would surrender his life interest under the marriage settlement and would settle upon her shares in companies, interest in loans and mortgages, and money on fixed deposit, the whole now amounting to a further £48,000 in addition to her share in the marriage settlement. Watt drowned at Bilgola Beach on the 21st of May 1921. His former wife married Sydney Irving Barlow Lawford, and she died on the 9th of August 1936. Mr. Justice Nicholas decided that £500 a year ceased to be payable to the child of the marriage, James Oswald Watt, on the death of his late mother, but he was now entitled to one half, £24,000 of the total fund, and the other half to be distributed in accordance with the provisions of the will of the late Walter Oswald Watt. Upon his father's death, James Oswald Watt received £500 annually for his education and so on, being under 21. But the court was asked to decide whether this ceased on the death of Mrs. Watt. Although His Honour decided that the £500 allotted annually would be ceased, he then decided that James Oswald Watt had an interest in half of the settled fund. And in 2016, there was a book written by Chris Clark on Oswald Watt called The High Life of Oswald Watt, Australia's first military pilot, if you're interested in looking at further reading.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.